The air in the deep archives was a physical presence, thick with the dust of 10,000 years and cold enough to leach the warmth from a soul. Inquisitor Valeria moved through the oppressive silence, her boots making no sound on the worn adamantium grille of the walkway. The only light came from the single lumen globe hovering at her shoulder, its pale glow pushing back the absolute blackness just enough to reveal endless rows of sealed stasis scripts. Each one was a tomb for knowledge deemed too dangerous, too heretical, or too sacred for any but the most sanctioned eyes. Her own authorization, etched into a crystalline rosette, felt like a fragile key to an infinite prison. She was an imperial scholar of the Ordo Scriptorum, her life dedicated to the curation, and when necessary, the eradication of information. Yet the deeper she descended, the more her purpose felt like a violation. This was not the well-ordered scriptorium of the surface. This was the gut of the Imperium, a place where truths were swallowed and left to digest in perpetual darkness. Her archaeotech gear hummed softly in her hands, a complex array of auspex scanners and mechadendritic interfaces designed to commune with systems that had been ancient when the Great Crusade began. With precise, practiced movements, she bypassed a final security protocol, a psychoreactive field that would have boiled the mind of any unauthorized intruder. The massive, rune-encrusted portal groaned open, its protest echoing down forgotten corridors. The chamber beyond was small, a forgotten reliquary. Dust lay in soft, gray blankets over everything, undisturbed for millennia. In the center, upon a plinth of black obsidian, sat her objective. It was a data log, a slab of tarnished bronze and frosted crystal, no larger than a codex. A single, stark symbol was stamped into its casing, the Imperial Aquila, but crossed with a jagged line of prohibition, a universal sigil for ultimate heresy. Warnings were etched around its edge in high Gothic, speaking of eternal damnation and the purging of souls for any who dared to breach its seals. Valeria's hand hovered over the device, her breath catching in her throat. The conflict was a familiar, gnawing beast within her. Duty screamed for her to report its location, to call in the tech priests to scuttle it into a plasma furnace. But curiosity, that most insidious of temptations, whispered of the secrets it held. What truth could be so terrible that it had been buried in the deepest, darkest vault beneath the throne world itself? What single piece of knowledge warranted such absolute silence? She felt the weight of ages pressing down on her, the collective fear and determination of every soul who had sealed this thing away. With a resolve that felt both sacred and profane, her fingers closed around the cold, dusty metal. The descent was over. The silence was about to be broken. The datalog was cold and inert in Valeria's hands, a sliver of forgotten history that felt heavier than any star fortress. Back within the relative safety of her private scriptorium cell, the air hummed with the low thrum of active machinery and the scent of ozone and sacred oils. She had cleared a space on her worn adamantium desk, the datalog sitting at its center like an altarpiece to a forbidden god. Her archaeotech interfaces, a tangle of crystalline filaments and copper wiring, now connected her cogitator to the ancient device. With a final, whispered litany of activation, she initiated the decryption sequence. The runes on the datalog's surface flickered, a faint, internal light stirring within the frosted crystal. A sound emerged from the speakers, not the clean, binary chatter of a data stream, but a voice. It was a voice stripped of the godlike resonance attributed to it by 10,000 years of state-sanctioned dogma. It was human. Deep, resonant, and burdened with an immense and tangible weight, but unmistakably, terrifyingly human. It was the voice of the Emperor of Mankind, recorded in an age before his interment upon the Golden Throne. Valeria's breath hitched, her entire body going rigid as the sound filled the small chamber. This was not a divine proclamation. It was a strategist's report, a commander's grim assessment. He spoke of the Great Crusade, not as a glorious, holy war, but as a desperate galactic triage. His words painted a picture of a humanity shattered, isolated on countless worlds, regressing into barbarism or falling prey to Xeno's predators and worse. Unity was not presented as a divine mandate, but as a biological and cultural imperative for survival. The alternative, he stated with a cold, pragmatic clarity, was extinction. Then came the first tremor of something truly heretical, a nascent, carefully worded fear. He spoke of a tempest in the Imperium, a psychic resonance of collective sentient despair that could twist and corrupt. He did not name it chaos, not yet, but the dread in his tone was a palpable force, a shadow falling across the recording. He moved on to speak of his tools for this salvation, the Primarchs. In the Imperial Creed, they were demigods, the beloved sons of a divine father. In this recording, they were described with the dispassionate precision of a master geneticist. They were engines of conquest, unified templates for a new humanity. Their creation, a necessary gambit to accelerate the reunification he so desperately needed. There was pride in their design, yes, a scientist's satisfaction in a perfect formula, but the paternal love of the hagiographies was absent. Instead, Valeria heard the tension in his voice, the fear that these magnificent, powerful beings, these living weapons, could themselves become the very instruments of the corruption he sought to defeat. A profound and unsettling empathy bloomed within Valeria's chest. This was not the detached, omnipotent God-Emperor she had worshipped since childhood. This was a man, a being of incalculable power. Yes, but a being nonetheless, shouldering the fate of an entire species alone. He sounded weary. He sounded concerned. He sounded mortal. The foundations of her faith, so deeply ingrained they felt like part of her skeleton, did not shatter, but they groaned under a sudden, immense strain. A hairline fracture had appeared in the monolith of her belief, and through it seeped the chilling draft of a truth far more complex and terrifying than any simple heresy. The Emperor had been afraid. And for the first time in her life, kneeling in the humming silence of her cell, Inquisitor Valeria was afraid with him. The heavy, rhythmic tread of armored boots echoed through the stone corridor outside her cell, a sound as familiar and menacing as a death knell. Valeria's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. In a single, fluid motion born of sudden, cold terror, she swept the data log from her desk, the ancient device feeling like a shard of live promethium in her hands. The cogitator screen went dark, the Emperor's mortal fears vanishing back into digital silence. She shoved the slab into a hidden compartment beneath a loose floor tile, her movements precise and silent, the dust from the archive still clinging to her robes like a guilty shroud. She was just settling back into her chair, a data slate on Imperial tithe regulations opened before her, when the shadows at her door thickened. Two Adeptus Arbites stood there, their black carapace armor absorbing the light, their featureless helms scanning the room with impersonal menace. They did not speak, their silence more accusatory than any demand. They were the mailed fist of imperial law, the enforcers of absolute conformity, and their presence so close to her secret felt like a blade pressed against her throat. After an eternity of heartbeats, they moved on, their footsteps fading back into the hum of the fortress monastery. Valeria did not release her breath until the silence returned, heavy and pregnant with threat. Alone again, the fear did not abate. It curdled into a sharp, obsessive need. Waiting until the depths of the night cycle, when the only sounds were the distant, mournful hymns of servo skulls and the groan of ancient architecture, she retrieved the data log. Its cold weight was a comfort and a condemnation. Connecting it once more, she delved deeper, bypassing layers of cryptographic security that would have baffled a lesser mind. The new entries were different, fragmented and laced with symbols that were not part of any imperial cipher she knew. They were angular, geometric shapes that seemed to writhe on the screen, hinting at concepts that strained the edges of comprehension. Interspersed with logs detailing the mustering of Legion fleets were strings of alphanumeric code that, when cross-referenced with astrocartographic data, pointed to a specific, cataclysmic event, the Istvan system. Her obsession was a fever in her blood, burning away sleep in sustenance. Each decoded string felt like picking a lock on a tomb that held not a corpse but a live grenade. The risks were monumental, a symphony of heresy playing out in her mind. To possess this knowledge was a capital offense. To seek it was to spit upon the imperial creed. To believe it was to invite damnation. Yet the more she learned, the more the sanctioned history of the Imperium felt like a beautiful, gilded cage, and the whispers from this forbidden device felt like the key. The symbols she uncovered seemed to form a pattern, a hidden language speaking of betrayal not as a simple act of treachery, but as an inevitable, calculated pivot in a war that was far more complex than the tale of a fallen son. They hinted at schisms that ran deeper than loyalty, at truths so devastating they had to be entombed not just in physical vaults, but in the very consciousness of humanity. Valeria was no longer just an inquisitor investigating a relic. She was an archaeologist of blasphemy, carefully brushing the dust from a past that threatened to shatter her present, listening to the whispers in the dark that promised either revelation or ruin. The next log opened not with the weary tones of a commander, but with the crisp, analytical cadence of a scientist at the peak of his craft. Valeria leaned closer, the sterile light of the cogitator's screen reflecting in her wide eyes. This was the Emperor's laboratory log, a raw feed from the genesis of demigods. He spoke not of sons, but of specimens, of 20 unique genetic matrices designated by numbers and titles that were more operational than paternal. His voice was a tapestry woven with threads of supreme arrogance and a profound, chilling vulnerability. He described the process in vivid, technical detail, the weaving of engrammatic psychic resonances into physical DNA, the forging of superhuman organs within amniotic cradles of spun starlight and focused warp energy. Each Primarch was to be a perfect fusion of Materium and Immaterium, a biological and psychic lighthouse to guide humanity from the darkness. In his words, Valeria heard the echo of a creator god, sculpting a new race from the clay of the old, his ambition a fire that threatened to consume the very galaxy. Yet beneath the technical triumph, a counter-melody of dread played. He spoke of psychic contaminants, of the inherent volatility of the Empyrean substrate used in their creation. He feared not just external corruption, but an inherent flaw in the design itself. The very power that made them perfect tools for unity also made them perfect vessels for dissolution. He cataloged potential failure states with a pathologist's cold eye. Magnus's psychic potential leading to a catastrophic breach of reality. Angron's neural architecture predisposed to uncontrollable rage. Lorger's innate need for devotion creating a vacuum that any malevolent creed could fill. The laboratory, in his description, was not just a place of creation, but a fortress against a silent, insidious enemy that sought to turn his masterpieces into weapons against him. The duality was staggering. In the same breath he spoke of gifting humanity its saviors, he meticulously planned for the eventuality of having to destroy them. The recording shifted. The sterile hum of the laboratory was replaced by the quiet crackle of a fire and the soft rustle of robes. Another voice entered the log, aged, weary, and laced with an immeasurable loyalty. It was Malcador the Sigillite. His counsel was a soft counterpoint to the Emperor's monumental isolation. He did not question the science, but the burden. The weight of this alone will break a lesser star, Malcador murmured, his words not a challenge, but a statement of fact. In these moments, the Emperor's tone would shift, the godlike architect receding to reveal a being of immense, crushing loneliness. He confessed to doubts, not in his plan, but in his own capacity to bear the solitude of command, the agony of making decisions that would cost trillions of lives. Malcador's presence was the single pillar in a vast, empty hall, a reminder of a connection that transcended the master-servant dynamic. It was a friendship, and hearing the Emperor speak to him was to witness a crack in divine armor, a glimpse of the man who had walked the earth for millennia, now preparing to send his 20 greatest hopes and fears out into a hostile universe. Valeria listened, her own breath shallow. She was no longer in her scriptorium cell, but a ghost in that ancient laboratory, witnessing the birth of legends and the sowing of their doom. The psychic bonds he described, the intricate web of connection between himself and his creations, were not just lines of command, but living, volatile circuits of power and emotion. He had forged beings of immense love and capacity for loyalty, knowing that same capacity could curdle into the most galaxy-shattering hatred. The Primarch Project was not merely an act of creation. It was the ultimate gamble, a wager that the light he had kindled within them would outshine the infinite darkness waiting to snuff it out. And as the log concluded, Valeria understood with a sickening certainty that the Horus heresy was not a tragic accident. It was a possibility written into their very genes, a specter that had haunted their creator from the moment of their conception. The confrontation came not in the deep silence of the archives, but in the stark, unforgiving light of her own scriptorium. Inquisitor Marcus filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the exit, his presence a sudden, chilling pressure drop in the room. He was a man carved from the same grim certainty as the imperial statues that lined the Hall of Judgment, his faith an unbreachable fortress. His eyes, pale and sharp as flint, swept over her workspace, missing nothing, lingering on the dust motes still dancing in the air, the faint, out-of-place grime on the edge of her desk. Valeria's blood ran cold, her mind screaming a single silent warning. The datalog felt less like a hidden object and more like a psychic beacon, pulsing with its own damnable truth from beneath the floor. He did not accuse her outright. That was not his way. Instead, he wove a net of quiet, pointed questions, his voice a low, relentless drumbeat. He spoke of irregular power drains in the sublevel conduits, of Auspex ghosts reported by the Arbite's patrols, of a disturbance in the sanctioned quiet of the lower vaults. Each word was a brick, meticulously laid to build a wall around her. He watched her, his gaze a physical weight, searching for a flicker of guilt, a tremor of fear. Valeria felt the lie take shape in her throat, a cold, slithering thing. She spoke of a malfunctioning cogitator, of her own obsessive cross-referencing of pre-heresy logistical data, of long, unauthorized vigils spent chasing a phantom correlation in the records. The words tasted like ash. She was a scholar of truth, her life dedicated to its preservation, and here she was, weaving a tapestry of deceit for one of her own. She met his eyes, forcing a calm she did not feel, her performance a masterpiece of half-truths and misdirection. She saw a flicker of something in his stony expression, not belief, but a temporary, grudging acceptance of the plausible. With a final, warning glance that promised this was not over, he turned and left, his shadow stretching long and accusing behind him. The guilt was a poison in her veins, slow and corrosive. It clung to her as she went through the motions of her official duties, annotating data slates and presiding over minor doctrinal reviews. Every time she reaffirmed the Imperial Creed, every time she spoke of the God Emperor's divine and infallible plan, the memory of that human, weary voice from the datalog echoed in her mind, turning her words into hollow blasphemies. Her loyalty, once a single, unbreakable pillar, was now a thing fractured, pulling her in two agonizing directions. One path led back to the light of sanctioned ignorance, to the comfort of the faith she had known her entire life. The other led deeper into the dark, following the trail of a truth that promised only to shatter that faith forever. That night, the temptation was a siren's call she could not resist. With the memory of Marcus's suspicion a fresh brand on her conscience, she returned to the datalog, her hands trembling as she re-established the connection. The new entries she uncovered were darker, more personal. They spoke not of grand strategy, but of cost. The Emperor detailed psychic expenditures of such magnitude they threatened to unravel his own cellular structure, the toll of holding the nascent Imperium together while fighting a secret, unseen war in the Empyrean. He described the agony of severing a fragment of his own consciousness to imbue the Primarchs, a self-mutilation of the soul for the sake of the grand design. He spoke of watching ordinary men and women, his unified humanity, die by the billions in wars he had orchestrated, their lives become mere statistics in a cosmic calculation for survival. There was no divine detachment in these logs, only a grim, relentless accounting of sacrifice, a ledger written in pain and loss. Valeria read them, and the guilt for her deception to Marcus was joined by a new, more profound sorrow, a mourning for the being who had borne this unimaginable burden, and for the Imperium that had been built upon the foundation of his silent, endless suffering. The conflict was no longer abstract. It was a war raging in the confines of her own soul, with every decoded entry another casualty in the battle between her loyalty and her desperate, terrifying need for the truth. The recording that followed was a scar upon the air, a raw, psychic wound given voice. There was no preamble, no clinical analysis. The Emperor's voice, when it came, was a ruin of its former self, stripped of all authority and resonance, reduced to a ragged, agonized whisper that seemed to bleed from the speakers. Valeria leaned forward, her own breath held captive in her lungs, as the full, devastating weight of the Horus heresy crashed down upon her through this single, intimate confession. This was not a history lesson. It was an autopsy of a father's heart. He spoke of Horus Lupercal, and the name was not that of an arch-traitor, but a lamentation. The words were choked, fractured by a grief so profound it felt like a physical force in the room. He described the moment of realization, not as a strategic catastrophe, but as a personal, soul-rending failure. He recounted the subtle shifts in the War Master's aura, the once brilliant light of his favored sun dimming, then curdling into a kaleidoscope of chaotic hues. He spoke of the psychic echo of Horus's fall, a scream across the immaterium that he had felt as keenly as a blade in his own spine. The strategic implications of the betrayal, the sundered legions, the burning worlds, were mentioned only as the ghastly symptoms of a deeper, more personal disease. The heresy in his telling was first and foremost a sickness of the spirit, a corruption of the most perfect instrument of his will. Then came the confession, the core of the heresy she now held in her hands. The God Emperor of mankind, the silent divinity upon the golden throne, admitted to a failure of love. His voice broke as he recounted designing the Primarchs, forging them with the cold precision of a master artisan. He had given them strength, intellect, and purpose, but he confessed he had withheld the one thing that might have anchored them against the tempests of the warp, the simple, human bond of a father's unconditional love. He had been their creator, their commander, their God, but he had never allowed himself to be their father. He saw them as magnificent tools, and in doing so, he had left a void in their souls, a hollow space that the whispers of the dark gods had found and filled with promises of the devotion he had failed to provide. The anguish in his voice was a tangible thing as he named his own pride, his own emotional distance, as the critical flaw in the grand design. The fall of Horus was not just the triumph of chaos, it was the price of his own paternal failure. Valeria sat back, the world tilting on its axis. The image of the divine, infallible emperor, the cornerstone of her entire existence, dissolved like mist in the face of this raw, human vulnerability. Here was no detached God orchestrating a predestined tragedy, but a being of immense power shattered by regret, mourning the son he had lost and blaming himself for the loss. The contrast between this broken, grieving voice and the omnipotent, silent icon of the imperial creed was absolute. The divinity of the emperor was a story told to comfort trillions. This, the raw and wretched truth of a creator grieving his creation, was the terrifying reality. The heresy was not just a galactic war, it was a family tragedy of cosmic proportions, and its root was not in the evil of Horus, but in the tragic, love-starved heart of the father who had made him. The next entry bloomed in Valeria's mind not as sound, but as a cascade of schematics and psychic impressions, a grand design of such staggering ambition that it dwarfed even the creation of the Primarchs. This was the Human Webway Project. The Emperor's voice returned, no longer broken by grief, but charged with a fierce, almost desperate hope. He described it as the ultimate emancipation, a masterstroke to sever humanity's doomed reliance on the hellish tides of the warp. His words painted a vision of a labyrinthine network of tunnels and gateways carved not through the Imperium, but within the stable buffer between reality and the Empyrean, a psychic subway system connecting the stars. It was to be a realm of pure reason, a place where human ships could traverse the galaxy without Gellar fields, without navigators, without ever risking the predatory horrors of the warp. In this grand design, Valeria saw the pinnacle of the Emperor's dream, a humanity truly free, its destiny no longer hostage to the very chaos he feared. But the dream curdled into nightmare. The tone of the recording shifted from visionary zeal to the grim, clipped reports of a commander watching his front line collapse. The failure was not one of engineering, but of containment, a breach. The Emperor described it with the chilling precision of a surgeon describing a fatal wound. Magnus the Red, in a catastrophic attempt to warn his father of Horus's betrayal, had shattered the psychic wards protecting the Imperial webway from the raw warp. The descriptions that followed were not visual, but sensory and emotional impressions burned into the log with psychic force. Valeria's senses were flooded with the shrieking of never-born things as they poured into the sanctified tunnels, their forms a blasphemy against geometry and life. She felt the searing heat of demonic essence corroding golden walls, the psychic backlash like a scream across every human soul connected to the project. The Emperor's own presence became a bulwark, a blazing star of will holding the rupture closed, but the cost was astronomical. He spoke of the talons of the Emperor fighting and dying in a war that could never be won, only contained, of the endless tide of filth and madness that pressed against the failing seals. The grand dream of a safe passage for humanity had become a gaping wound in reality, and the Emperor himself was the finger in the dam, holding back an ocean of damnation. The final entries on the project were the most harrowing. The ambition was gone, replaced by a grim, unyielding determination that bordered on despair. The webway was lost, a beautiful dream now a festering abscess beneath the palace. But the project's ultimate purpose, the Golden Throne, remained. It was no longer a key to a new future, but a prison cell and a life support system for the warden. The Emperor detailed the throne's true, horrifying function: to keep that warp breach sealed, to channel his incalculable psychic might into a perpetual act of denial against the tidal force of chaos. His determination was absolute, a cold, hard knot of will, but the cost of that ambition was laid bare. The freedom of a species had been gambled and lost, and the price was the eternal sacrifice of its greatest protector, chained to a machine whose only purpose was to hold back the hell his own plan had unleashed. Valeria slumped back, the phantom stench of ozone and blood fading from her nostrils. The infallibility of the imperial edifice, already cracked, now crumbled further. The God Emperor was not a flawless architect whose plans were thwarted by betrayal alone. He was a gambler who had staked everything on a single, brilliant, catastrophic roll of the dice. The Imperium she served, with its ossified dogma and brutal repression, was not the intended outcome of a divine plan, but the scar tissue left behind by a failure of almost unimaginable scale. Her doubt was no longer a subtle whisper, but a roaring certainty. The Imperium was not built on a foundation of truth, but on the ruins of a shattered dream, and its God was not a divine being guiding humanity to a glorious destiny, but a prisoner eternally atoning for the cost of his own magnificent ambition. The air in Valeria's scriptorium, once a sanctuary of quiet study, now felt thick with invisible eyes. Every creak of the ancient rock creep, every distant footfall in the corridor, was a potential herald of discovery. The confrontation with Inquisitor Marcus had drawn a line in the dust, and she now stood on the wrong side of it, her every movement shadowed by the cold, unblinking scrutiny of Imperial authority. She could feel the noose of suspicion tightening around her neck, a subtle but inexorable pressure that made the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. Her official duties became a pantomime of piety, her hands moving over sanctioned texts while her mind remained trapped in the forbidden echoes of the datalog. She took different routes through the archives, doubled back on her path, and spent hours in open, orthodox research, all to weave a tapestry of normalcy over the festering secret in her heart. Yet she knew it was not enough. Marcus was a bloodhound of faith, and he had caught the scent of her heresy. The datalog could no longer remain beneath a loose tile in her cell. The risk was too great. During the deepest, most silent watch of the night, when the fortress monastery seemed to hold its breath, she embarked on a perilous pilgrimage. Wrapped in a cloak the color of shadow, she moved like a ghost through the labyrinthine undercroft, her path lit only by the guttering glow of a single, shuttered lumen. Her destination was a place even the archivists had forgotten, a sub-level chamber, its entrance concealed behind a collapsed ventilation shaft and a curtain of thick, phosphorescent fungi that fed on the latent psychic resonance of the place. The chamber beyond was little more than a crack in the world, its walls weeping a slow, mineral-rich water that had stained the stone in swirling, iridescent patterns. Here, amidst the dripping silence and the faint, psychic hum, she concealed the datalog within a natural niche, sealing it with a smear of plastic and a prayer to no god in particular. It was a desperate act, a temporary haven for a truth that was becoming too dangerous to hold. Returning to her cell, the paranoia was a live wire under her skin. She waited a full cycle, her nerves stretched to their breaking point, before daring to retrieve the device once more. Connecting it with trembling hands in the newfound safety of the hidden chamber, she delved into the next layer of encrypted data. The revelations within were more shattering than any that had come before. The logs detailed the true dual purpose of the Golden Throne. It was not merely a life support system or a bulwark against the warp. It was an engine of unimaginable scope, designed to harness the collective psychic energy of a believing humanity. The Emperor's voice, strained and resonant with a terrible purpose, explained how the faith of quadrillions, their prayers and devotions, was being siphoned, refined, and focused through the throne's arcane mechanisms. This psychic torrent, this ocean of blind belief, was the only force potent enough to keep the Terran webway breach sealed and to sustain his ravaged consciousness in its perpetual, agonizing vigil. The Imperial Creed was not a spontaneous outpouring of devotion. It was a necessary component in a desperate, galactic-scale ritual. The God Emperor was a machine, and human faith was its fuel. The pressure of imminent discovery became a physical weight on her shoulders. Every shadow seemed to hold the silhouette of Marcus, every whisper of the air the rustle of Arbites. Armor. She decoded the entries in frantic, stolen hours, the glowing runes of the datalog illuminating her pale, strained face in the dripping dark. With each new piece of the terrible puzzle, the world she knew unraveled a little more. The Imperium was not a divine kingdom but a fortress built on a lie, its stability purchased with the currency of ignorance and the eternal suffering of its silent guardian. The noose was not just tightening around her. It was a symbol of the entire human race, bound and blinded by a necessary deception. and as she listened to the Emperor's calm, horrifying explanation of how he had engineered his own apotheosis through the faith of his people, Valeria knew that to be caught with this knowledge was not just to die, but to be erased from history, her very existence becoming one more secret buried in the dark. The recording opened not on the booming voice of a god, but on a silence so profound it felt like a physical wound. It was the silence of the throne room, a vast, cavernous space where the very air was thick with agony and the ozone scent of incalculable power. Valeria, huddled in her dripping, hidden chamber, felt the oppressive weight of that silence press down on her, a suffocating blanket woven from despair and necessity. Then a sound emerged, a ragged, wet inhalation, the sound of a body pushed far beyond its mortal limits. It was the voice of Malcador the Sigillite, but it was a ruin of the wise, measured tone she had heard in earlier logs. This voice was a dry leaf scraping on stone, each word a monumental effort of will. He spoke to the Emperor, his words not of strategy or statecraft, but of simple, unshakable loyalty. He detailed the failing of his own physical form, the way the Golden Throne was devouring him, cell by cell, soul by soul. He described the sensation as a cosmic fire burning through his veins, not consuming with heat, but with an absolute, annihilating cold that erased memory, identity, and life itself. Yet there was no fear in his tone, only a profound and weary acceptance. He offered his life not as a soldier offers his in battle, but as a friend offers the last cup of water in a desert. His sacrifice was a calculated, willing transaction, his mortality in exchange for a few precious hours for the Emperor to confront Horus. It was the final, definitive act of a man who had stood as the lone pillar of friendship for a being who could have no equals, the ultimate affirmation of a bond that transcended master and servant. Then the Emperor's voice entered the log, and it was a sound that tore at the fabric of Valeria's soul. It was stripped of all power, all resonance, reduced to a raw, human whisper of grief. He did not command. He did not accept the sacrifice with regal grace. He pleaded. His voice broke as he called Malcador by his name, not his title, the word a choked sob of denial. He argued, listing the Sigillite's unmatched wisdom, the centuries of service, the friendship that had been his only solace in an eternity of solitude. In that moment, the master of mankind was not a general sending a soldier to his death. He was a man watching his only friend walk willingly into a furnace, and he was powerless to stop it. The burden of leadership he described was not the weight of galactic command, but the agony of having to accept this ultimate gift, the crushing knowledge that the price of eternity was the life of the one person who had truly understood him. Malcador's final words were not for the Imperium, nor for the grand design, but for the friend he was leaving behind. He spoke of shared memories, of conversations held before roaring fires in ages past, of the simple, human moments that had been the true foundation of their work. His voice faded, becoming a faint, rustling echo, and then there was only the hum of the throne and the Emperor's silent, desolate presence. The recording held on that silence, a void where a monumental soul had been. Then the Emperor spoke once more, his voice now hollow, a bell cracked beyond repair. He revealed the true burden, the price not of power but of endurance. To be eternal was to witness every light extinguished, every bond severed by time, to be the sole rememberer in a universe of forgetting. Malcador's sacrifice was not just a key to victory. It was the final, searing lesson in the cost of the path he had chosen. The friendship was gone, consumed by the very machinery of survival, and all that remained was the endless, lonely vigil and the memory of a sacrifice that had purchased a future, but at the cost of the last shred of his own humanity. The final barrier within the datalog crumbled not with a bang, but with a whisper that carried the weight of a dying star. Valeria, curled in the damp, phosphorescent gloom of her hidden chamber, felt the last encryption sequence dissolve under her trembling fingers. The new data stream was not a single recording, but a fractured mosaic of moments, a chorus of voices from a doomed age that sang a hymn of systemic deceit. The first voice she deciphered was that of the Emperor, but it was not the weary commander or the grieving father. This was the voice of a teacher, patient and grim, explaining a fundamental, horrifying truth to a mind not yet ready to receive it. He spoke of chaos not as a heresy to be defeated, but as a law of the cosmos, an inevitable and eternal force born from the collective psyche of all sentient life. It was a cancer woven into the fabric of reality itself, a reflection of the universe's own capacity for madness and despair. Its victory was not a possibility to be averted, but a certainty to be delayed, a tide that could only be held back, never turned. Valeria's mind recoiled. The imperial creed, the bedrock of her existence, taught that faith in the God Emperor was a shield against the corrupting influence of the ruinous powers. It was a war of good against evil, light against dark. But this was a confession that the darkness was not an external enemy, but an internal one, a fundamental part of the human condition. The Emperor had not sought to destroy chaos. He had sought to insulate humanity from its most immediate ravages, to build a dam against an ocean that would, one day, inevitably break through. The Great Crusade, the imperial truth, the relentless persecution of religion, it had all been a grand, desperate quarantine. Her faith, the fervent prayers she had whispered since childhood, the absolute certainty that the Emperor's light would prevail, it was all a carefully constructed lie, a necessary fiction to keep the patient from realizing the disease was terminal. As this devastating truth settled in her gut like a shard of ice, the datalogue conjured another voice, sharp with youthful arrogance and intellectual fire. It was a Primarch. The timbre suggested Magnus, or perhaps Lorgar, challenging his father in a debate that felt more like a trial. The Primarch argued for transparency, for arming humanity with the knowledge of the warp's true nature, for building a society strong enough to face the truth without fracturing. He spoke with the passion of one who believed understanding was the ultimate weapon. The Emperor's response was not one of anger, but of profound, weary finality. He painted a picture of a galactic-scale panic, of entire systems plunging into madness at the revelation, of the chaos gods feasting on the resulting fear and despair. Secrecy was not a choice, he explained. It was the only option. The truth was a psychic poison that ordinary human minds could not process. The foundation of the Imperium had to be laid not on the unstable ground of cosmic horror, but on the solid, manageable rock of ignorance, order, and, if necessary, enforced dogma. Valeria saw the reflection of her own crisis in that ancient argument. She was that Primarch now, staring into the abyss and feeling her sanity tremble. The Imperial Creed was not a shield of faith, it was a blindfold. The God Emperor was not a divine protector. He was a warden, and the entire Imperium was his prison, its quadrillions of inhabitants serving a life sentence of blissful, necessary ignorance. The foundation of her belief, painstakingly built over a lifetime of devotion, did not just crack, it dissolved into dust. There was no divine plan, only a desperate, holding action against an unwinnable war. The Emperor was not a god who would one day rise and lead humanity to glory. He was a dying man on a golden chair, using the faith of those he had deceived as a battery to power the locks on their own cage. And in the dripping silence of her hiding place, surrounded by the iridescent tears of the stone, Inquisitor Valeria felt the last vestiges of her certainty crumble away, leaving only the terrifying, hollowed-out silence of the truth. The truth, when it finally came, was not a thunderous proclamation but a calm, horrifyingly lucid explanation that stripped away the last vestiges of mystery. The datalogue, cradled in Valeria's cold hands in the weeping dark of her hidden chamber, delivered the Emperor's ultimate confession. His voice was different now, not the passionate crusader, the grieving father, or the desperate scientist, but the architect of a terrible, necessary eternity. He spoke of the Golden Throne, not as a prison or a life support system, but as the most sophisticated psychic engine ever conceived, its true purpose far grander and more terrible than she had ever imagined. His silence upon the throne, he explained, was a deliberate, focused act. It was not merely to hold the warp breach sealed, a task that required an unimaginable portion of his will. That was only half of the function. The other half was an act of cosmic harvesting. The Emperor detailed, with the dispassionate clarity of a master physicist, the nature of psychic energy in a galaxy teeming with sentient life. Every human emotion, every prayer, every act of faith and devotion generated a resonant echo in the Imperium. For 10,000 years, the Imperial Creed had been carefully cultivated, its rituals and dogmas designed not for theological purity, but for psychic efficiency. It was a system engineered to produce a specific, potent form of energy, blind, unwavering faith. This faith, this ocean of psychic belief from a million worlds, was not wasted. The Golden Throne, in its ultimate function, acted as a galactic focus, a lens that gathered this raw, devotional power. The Emperor's own shattered consciousness was the conduit, the filter through which this chaotic torrent of belief was refined and directed. The faith of quadrillions became a psychic shield, a barrier of pure will that reinforced the material realm against the encroaching tides of chaos. It was the power that kept the demons at bay, that stabilized the warp for Imperial navigators, that subtly influenced reality in 1,000 unseen ways to prolong the Imperium's desperate existence. The Emperor was not just a guardian holding a door closed. He was a master weaver, using the threads of human belief to patch the fraying fabric of reality itself. The foundation of the Imperium, he revealed, was not built on truth, justice, or even military might alone. Its true foundation was this endless, self-perpetuating cycle of faith. The suffering, the wars, the entire brutal grinding machinery of the Adeptus Terra, it all served to sustain the population, to keep the countless billions believing, praying, and generating the psychic fuel he required. The Imperial Creed was not a comforting story. It was the primary power source for the most critical piece of technology in human history. His silence was the price for this harnessing. To speak, to reveal his mortal pain or his fallible nature, would shatter the illusion of divinity. If humanity knew their God was a dying, tortured man using their prayers as a battery, the faith would crumble, the shield would fail, and the warp would consume the galaxy in a final, screaming apocalypse. His eternal silence was the ultimate sacrifice, the necessary lie upon which all of reality now precariously balanced. Inquisitor Valeria listened, the cold of the chamber seeping into her bones, as the full, dreadful majesty of the Emperor's plan unfolded. He was not a god. He was a warden and an alchemist, and the entire human race was both his prisoner and the philosopher's stone, its faith the substance he transmuted into a shield against the night. The first sound was not a sound at all, but a tremor in the air, a shift in the pressure of the world that screamed of imminent violence. Valeria's head snapped up from the glowing runes of the data log, her heart seizing in her chest. The phosphorescent fungi clinging to the walls of her hidden chamber seemed to pulse in alarm, their faint light catching the frantic dance of dust motes shaken loose from the ceiling. Then came the true sounds, the distant, percussive thunder of blast doors being forced, the sharp, distinctive crack of Helgun fire, and the guttural, amplified shouts of stormtroopers. They were not in the deep archives. They were close, horrifyingly close. Inquisitor Marcus was not merely suspicious. He was conducting a purge, a systematic, brutal sweep of every chamber, every conduit, every forgotten crevice in the sector. He was raising the archives to find her heresy. Panic was a cold fire in her veins. There was no time for careful shutdowns or concealment. Her hands, moving with a speed born of pure terror, ripped the crystalline filaments from the data log. The Emperor's final, devastating confession on the nature of faith vanished from the cogitator's screen, leaving only the reflection of her own pale, wide-eyed face. She shoved the slab of ancient metal and crystal into the inner pocket of her robes, its weight an anchor of damnation against her ribs. It felt less like a relic and more like a live explosive, its truth a fuse that would immolate her and everyone in the vicinity if discovered. She burst from the hidden chamber, the curtain of fungi tearing like rotten flesh. The corridor outside was a chaos of flickering lumen strips and swirling dust. The air tasted of ozone and promethium. Shouts echoed, overlapping and directionless, a symphony of pursuit. She ran, her boots slipping on the damp, uneven stone, her mind a frantic map of the subterranean ruins. This was not the ordered adamantium grill of the main archives. This was the corpse of the fortress, a skeletal labyrinth of collapsed galleries, rusted pipe networks, and bottomless chasms bridged by crumbling rockcrete. She moved by instinct, ducking under fallen support beams and scrambling through gaps where the wall had given way to the crushing pressure of the planet. The ghost of the Emperor's warnings haunted her every step. The truth is a psychic poison. Secrecy is the only option. His calm, logical explanation for a galaxy-wide deception now felt like a personal epitaph. The peril of this knowledge was not an abstract concept. It was the hot breath of the hunters on her neck, the certain death that awaited if the datalog's weight was discovered in her robes. She dove into a side passage just as a squad of black-armored stormtroopers rounded a corner, their red helmet lenses scanning the darkness. She pressed herself into a fissure in the wall, the cold, wet stone leaching the warmth from her back. Their amplified voxcasters barked static and orders. Scan for biosigns. He wants the scholar alive. The relic is primary. Marcus's voice, filtered through one of the helms, was a blade of ice. He was not just hunting a rogue inquisitor. He was hunting the truth itself, and he would burn this entire underworld to cinders to prevent it from seeing the light. As their footsteps receded, Valeria slipped from her hiding place and ran again, her lungs burning. The chase was a brutal, physical manifestation of the repressive regime she served. The Imperium was a machine designed to grind down dissent, to extinguish curiosity, to enforce a blissful, necessary ignorance upon all of humanity. And she, a loyal cog in that machine for her entire life, had now become a piece of grit in its gears, a single, fragile vessel for a truth so dangerous it threatened to jam the entire, monstrous apparatus. She leaped across a gap where the floor had fallen away into impenetrable blackness, the datalog slamming against her chest with the impact of her landing. The peril of knowledge in this empire of lies was absolute. To know was to sin, to seek was to rebel, and to possess what she now carried was a death sentence, echoing through the dark, hunted ruins. The recording that surfaced from the datalog's deepest core was unlike any that had come before. It was not a log, a confession, or a lament. It was a strategic briefing delivered to an empty room, a soliloquy of pure, undiluted dread. The Emperor's voice was stripped of all emotion, a cold, hard instrument of analysis, and the analysis it delivered threatened to unravel the very concept of reality. Valeria, shivering in the perpetual damp of her hidden chamber, felt a new kind of fear take root in her soul, a fear not of gods or men, but of the absolute, existential void that lay beyond them. He began by dismantling the foundational understanding of the Imperium's Great War. Chaos, he stated with chilling finality, was not the ultimate enemy. The ruinous powers, for all their boundless malice and reality-warping power, were merely symptoms of a sentient cosmos, a cancer born from the psychic effluent of living beings. They were a part of the universe's ecosystem, however horrific. The true enemy, the one that haunted his every calculation and fueled his most desperate gambits, was something else entirely. It was an entity from outside, a presence from the cold, starless gulfs between galaxies, a force of absolute negation that he could only describe as the Oblivion's heart. It was not a god of rage, pleasure, decay, or ambition, It was a god of silence, a sentient void that consumed not just matter and energy, but time, thought, memory, and the very potential for existence. Where chaos sought to twist and corrupt reality, this entity sought only to unmake it, to return all of creation to a state of perfect, undifferentiated nothingness. The Emperor's plans for humanity's evolution, the Great Crusade, the Webway Project, the creation of the Primarchs, they were all revealed as frantic, last-ditch fortifications against this cosmic tide. He detailed his vision not of a galaxy united for its own glory, but of a species psychically awakened and technologically ascended into a single, unified consciousness. A humanity so powerful, so collectively potent, that it could become a bastion against the encroaching dark, a wall of sentient light holding back the final, eternal night. The Primarchs were not just tools for conquest. They were the prototypes for this new, divine humanity, their scattered genetic legacies intended to seed this evolution across the stars. His desperation was a palpable force in the recording. Time was the one resource even he lacked. The Oblivion's heart was slow, patient, inevitable, but it was coming. And the Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war that had crippled his dream and chained him to the throne, had been more than a tragedy. In the Emperor's cold, strategic assessment, it had been a catastrophic diversion. While he and his sons had torn the heart out of the nascent Imperium, while the forces of chaos had celebrated their Pyrrhic victory, the true, silent enemy had drawn infinitely closer, its approach unnoticed amidst the din of a galaxy at war with itself. The heresy had not just broken the Emperor's body, it had shattered humanity's only shield, all while the true storm gathered in the unimaginable dark beyond. The final encryption dissolved like a sigh in the dark, and the last of the datalog's secrets poured forth, not as a torrent, but as a slow, chilling tide that promised to drown the galaxy in a new understanding. Valeria, huddled in the dripping silence of her hidden chamber, felt the world narrow to the glow of the screen and the weight of the words forming there. This was the core of it all, the terrible heart of the mystery she had pursued through dust and danger. The Emperor's voice, when it came, was a raw, strained thing, stripped of all grandeur, reduced to the agonized whisper of a man enduring an unendurable torment. He was not speaking of strategy or cosmic threats now. He was describing the nature of his own existence, and in doing so, he shattered the very concept of his divinity. He spoke of the Golden Throne, not as a symbol of power, but as a masterfully crafted illusion, a gilded cage of unimaginable complexity whose primary function was to perform a continuous, galaxy-spanning deception. Vivid, horrifying imagery flooded Valeria's mind as he detailed its mechanisms. He described arcane biotransference conduits fused directly to his ravaged nervous system, siphoning his life essence not to sustain him, but to power the psychic projection of his divine image. He spoke of pain as a constant, searing fire that scoured his consciousness, a necessary catalyst to generate the psychic resonance that the throne's machinery then amplified and broadcast across the Imperium. The golden light that surrounded him in the state-sanctioned icons was not a halo of holiness, but the visible bleed-off of this agonizing process, the scream of a soul translated into a comforting, brilliant lie. The throne was not a life support system. It was a torture device of cosmic proportions, and its true purpose was to hide the simple, mortal truth. The Emperor was dying. The illusion of divinity, he explained, was the most critical component of the entire imperial apparatus. The faith of humanity, that boundless ocean of belief, was not merely a shield against the warp as she had learned. It was a lifeline, a psychic transfusion. The throne's most secret function was to act as a filter, drawing upon that faith, refining its raw, devotional energy, and using it to perform a single, desperate act, to slow the inexorable process of his physical and spiritual decay. Each prayer offered in his name, each hymn sung in a cathedral world, Each soul that died with his name on their lips generated a trickle of power that was fed back into the failing systems, delaying the final moment of his death by another second, another hour. The God Emperor was a mortal psyker of incalculable power, yes, but he was a mortal nonetheless, and the Golden Throne was using the faith of trillions as a dam against the river of his own mortality. The divinity the Imperium worshipped was a phantom, a magnificent, necessary ghost sustained by the very belief it inspired, a feedback loop of faith and suffering, designed to hold back the silence of a true and final death. Valeria stared at the runes, her own breath shallow in her chest. The Emperor's pain was no longer an abstract concept. It was a tangible force in the chamber, a psychic echo of 10,000 years of unrelenting agony. She saw past the gold and the marble of the state-sanctioned imagery to the terrible reality. A broken man wired into a monstrous machine, his body a ruin, his mind a fortress under eternal siege, using the last of his will not to command or to guide, but to perpetuate the lie that kept him from oblivion. The moment of truth was not one of triumph, but of devastating, soul-crushing clarity. The God Emperor was a fiction. The divine light was a death rattle. And the entire Imperium of man, in all its brutal, glorious, and tragic majesty, was a monument built not to a god, but to the desperate, ongoing effort to delay a single, mortal man's final breath. The final, silent truth settled upon Valeria not as a shock, but as a slow, crushing weight, pressing the air from her lungs and the warmth from her blood. In the dripping dark of her hidden chamber, surrounded by the weeping stone and the faint, sickly glow of the phosphorescent fungi, the full, horrific scope of the secret became terrifyingly clear. The Emperor was not a god. He was a man, a psyker of unimaginable power, yes, but a mortal man, his body broken, his spirit chained to a golden engine of torment. The imperial creed, the bedrock of a million worlds, the faith that had guided her every step and given meaning to countless trillions of lives, was a lie. A necessary, calculated, and brilliantly engineered lie, but a lie nonetheless. It was the scaffolding holding up a collapsing reality, the blindfold on a species that would go mad if it saw the abyss it stood above. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sob that was also a laugh, choked off by the sheer, suffocating magnitude of it all. Her mind, trained for decades to process complex data and esoteric lore, could not contain this. It spilled over, flooding her with a grief so vast it felt galactic in scale. She saw them then, not as faceless masses in state-sanctioned texts, but as individuals. The pilgrim on his knees, scraping his forehead raw on the marble of a cathedral floor. The guardsman whispering a prayer for salvation as alien horrors poured over the trenches. The entire populations of hive cities and agri-worlds, their lives of toil and suffering given a shred of meaning by the belief in a divine watching protector. Billions, trillions, quadrillions, all of them, every single soul, living and dying within the confines of a beautiful, gilded deception. They offered their faith, their love, their very lives to a ghost, to a phantom sustained by their own devotion, a cosmic parasite feeding on hope to delay its own extinction. Her body began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that started in her hands and radiated outwards until her teeth chattered. The careful, analytical composure of the imperial scholar shattered, and what remained was a raw, exposed nerve of pure emotion. She slid from the makeshift stool, her knees hitting the cold, wet stone with a jarring impact she did not feel. Tears, hot and silent, carved paths through the grime on her cheeks. This was not the grief of personal loss, but the mourning of an entire civilization. She wept for the humanity that had been cheated of its potential, shackled to a destiny of ignorance for its own survival. She wept for the courage it must have taken for the Emperor to make this choice, to sacrifice his own truth, his own name, and to endure an eternity of agony to build this prison of faith for the ones he sought to protect. The sacrifice was not just his, it was everyone's. The entire human race was an unwitting participant in its own grand, tragic confinement. Curling in on herself on the damp floor, she let the waves of despair wash over her. The revelation was a poison in her soul, and her emotional breakdown was the convulsion of her spirit trying to expel it. All the certainties of her life were gone, replaced by this terrible, hollow knowledge. The God Emperor was a story told to children. The imperial truth was a shield made of lies, and her own purpose, her life's work as a guardian of knowledge, felt like the most profound hypocrisy. She had been a warden in the very prison she now knew she inhabited, enforcing the silence that kept the walls from tumbling down. In the absolute darkness, broken only by the faint, accusing glow of the dormant datalog, Inquisitor Valeria grieved for the truth that had to die, for the faith that had to be a lie, and for the silent, suffering man on the golden throne whose ultimate, terrible sacrifice was to become the god he never was. The storm of grief subsided, leaving behind a landscape of absolute clarity, cold and stark as a glacier-scoured plain. Valeria remained on the damp stone floor of her hidden chamber, the tremors in her body finally stilled, her mind a silent, hollowed-out vessel. The truth was no longer a shock to be absorbed. It was a fact, immense and undeniable, a monolith of terrible knowledge that now stood where her faith had once been. And with that knowledge came the choice, a binary fork in the path of her existence that would determine the fate of the galaxy. To reveal the truth was to shatter the lens of the Golden Throne, to cut the fuel line of faith that sustained the psychic shield and slowed the Emperor's death. It would be an act of ultimate honesty that would plunge a million worlds into madness and despair, unleashing the chaos the deception was built to contain and inviting the silent, hungry void beyond. To bury it was to become an accomplice to the greatest lie ever told, to condemn quadrillions to a life of blissful ignorance, to perpetuate the very system of repression she had begun to question, all for the grim, pragmatic cause of survival. Her mind drifted back, not to the state-sanctioned hagiographies, but to the raw, human voice from the datalog. She heard the Emperor's weary explanation to a questioning Primarch, his words not of divine decree, but of heartbreaking necessity. A mind cannot be prepared for a truth that will unmake it. The foundation must be laid upon solid ground, even if that ground is a fiction. The alternative is not enlightenment, but annihilation. He had spoken of necessary deception not with pride, but with the grim resolve of a surgeon amputating a limb to save a life. The entire Imperium was that life, gangrenous with the potential for a truth-induced panic. The faith was the tourniquet. Her own crisis of belief, her own shattering, was the very outcome his silence was designed to prevent on a galactic scale. To spread this revelation would be to perform that amputation without anesthesia on the entire human race. The resolution did not arrive as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, sinking certainty, a weight settling into her soul that felt as permanent and heavy as the rock of Terra itself. There was no victory to be found here, no righteous path that led to a brighter future. There was only the lesser of two cosmic evils. The morality of truth was a luxury for a stable, safe universe. In this one, teetering on the brink of multiple apocalypses, survival was the only morality that mattered. The truth was a beautiful, pristine weapon, but to wield it was to kill the patient. The lie was a poison, but it was the medicine that kept the heart beating. Her duty was no longer to the abstract ideal of truth, but to the brutal, practical reality of humanity's continued existence. She would add her own silence to the Emperor's. She would become one more brick in the fortress of lies, one more guardian of the blindfold. It was a betrayal of everything she had once believed a scholar should be, a surrender of the very curiosity that had led her here. But it was the only choice that did not end in fire and screaming. With a final, shuddering breath that felt like the last exhalation of her old self, Inquisitor Valeria accepted the burden. The truth would die with her, interred in the dark, for the sake of a species that could not bear its light. The datalog was cold in her hands, a sliver of damned history that had burned its truth into the very fabric of her soul. In the weeping dark of her chamber, Valeria's movements were slow, ritualistic, as she prepared its final tune. She did not wipe it clean of her fingerprints or the psychic residue of her presence. Such gestures felt pointless against the scale of what it contained. Instead, she wrapped it in a scrap of her own robe, a shroud of personal allegiance to the lie she now served. The niche in the wall, the one she had thought a temporary haven, would be its eternal sepulcher. She sealed it not with plastic this time, but with a mortar of powdered stone and water from the weeping walls, the mixture as gray and hopeless as her resolve. Each smear of the paste was a silent vow, a burial of truth as final as interring a corpse. When the last trace of the relic was hidden, the wall looked no different from the rest of the damp, stained stone, a perfect, unmarked grave for a secret that could shatter reality. Returning to the world above was like stepping onto a stage after glimpsing the rotting machinery behind the sets. The familiar corridors of the scriptorium felt alien, the hushed reverence of her colleagues a pantomime she was now forced to join. She resumed her duties with automaton's precision, her hands moving over data slates, her voice reciting sanctioned litanies, her body performing the daily rites of the imperial scholar. But behind her eyes, the ghost of the datalog's truth flickered incessantly. She was haunted. The weary, human voice of the emperor whispered behind every booming decree from the ecclesiarchy. The image of the golden throne, as a torture device, superimposed itself over the glorious icons in every chapel. She saw the faithful not as blessed citizens of a divine kingdom, but as unwitting batteries, their devotion fueling a dying man's agonizing vigil against the dark. The haunting was not of fear, but of knowledge, a grim, isolating awareness that set her apart from every other soul in the Imperium forever. Her final test came on the sun-scorched steps of the Sanctum Imperialis. A procession of the faithful filled the grand boulevard, a river of humanity chanting and weeping, their faces upturned in ecstatic devotion. They were pilgrims from a dozen worlds, their lives of hardship given meaning by this single moment of proximity to their God. Valiera stood in the shadow of a great marble column, watching them. She saw the hope in their eyes, the absolute, unshakable faith that formed the bedrock of their existence. And she understood. This was not ignorance, it was innocence. To tear that innocence away would be an act of cosmic cruelty. Their faith, however based on a lie, was the very energy that kept the demons at bay and the silent, hungry void beyond the stars from rushing in. It was the grim, unutterable necessity. The Emperor's silence, and now her own, was the ultimate act of paternal love, a terrible, painful truth accepted so that these billions could continue to live and hope and believe in a comforting fiction. As the procession passed, their hymns washing over her, Inquisitor Valiera bowed her head, not in prayer but in solemn, eternal acceptance of her burden. The silence would be kept. The lie would endure. For the sake of humanity, the truth would remain buried in the dark, with her as its lone, haunted guardian.